Celebrating one of their own who rose to the highest office in the land. And it's now their turn to say their goodbyes.
That man was a brave man. He fought for our freedom. He fought not for Zimbabweans only, but the whole nation of Africa. He was a very kind person. Even in our village here, he was taking care about us.
He was a father-like to me. I'm worried and I'm crying. I'm very worried. All we have here in Zimbabwe and Zvimba, it's about Robert Mugabe.
The body is due here on Monday.
It's not a big problem because we have another 30 days that we are waiting for. So whether it comes today, tomorrow, the other day, to me it doesn't. It's just that the inconvenience to the people, to the public, because we need to put a closure for now.
As Mugabe's remains return to his humble beginnings, for his family that remained here, a reminder of the early days.
I was steering cattle. He used to get hold of the hole. Then we plowed. After plowing, from there we came home.
Chidagwa also shares how they felt after Mugabe was removed from office.
They were bitter about it. All of us were bitter, the whole family. But we couldn't help it. They must compensate to our family what they did. In Shona, we say, kuripa, ngozi. Ngozi, avatora. You see? It's like killing someone. When you kill someone, you must compensate.
But their immediate task, the rituals and traditions, bidding a son of the village farewell.
Well, there's much anticipation here in Zvimba in Mashonaland West, where the late former president spent his early years. Well, his body is scheduled to arrive here on Monday, and this is where locals will have the opportunity to pay their last respects. Well, Mugabe will be laid to rest in 30 days' time at the Heroes Acre Monument in Harare. Criselda Lewis, SABC News in Zvimba, Mashonaland West.
Right, I'm now joined on the line by political analyst Sanusha Naidu. Thanks so much for your time on SABC News. How have the events since former President Robert Mugabe's death given us an insight into what his legacy is?
Good evening, and thank you for the invitation to be on the show. I think former President Mugabe will be remembered as the national hero that took Zimbabwe into a liberation and a post-liberation independence. I think in the early years, he was very much the national hero, as your insert suggested, in terms of the kinds of issues he fought for, the fact that he had brought an important educational sector and encouraged education in terms of the skills base that we see now with regard to the Zimbabwean labor across the region and their footprint. And I think also in terms of the fact that in the context of agricultural policy, there was a very important food security policy in place during the early years of his presidency. And I think to a large extent over time, I think we've seen with regard to the commentaries and, of course, all of the responses to the passing of Robert Mugabe, the kinds of difficulties people have in remembering the early years and then being overshadowed by the later years of his presidency, which became a really contentious presidency because of the way in which his government and his governance evolved into what we kind of see the structural conditions of Zimbabwe today.
If we take a look at his funeral, both the leaders who attended as well as the people, the ordinary Zimbabweans who were on the stand, what can we make from that attendance and the caliber of people who were there?
I think there's always a generation that remembers Mugabe. I mean, I think the important thing to bear in mind is the fact that Zimbabwe represented a very strategic post-liberation identity for Southern Africa, particularly with regard to the way they had negotiated with the British, the way in which they challenged the Ian Smith regime, and more importantly, in terms of the dynamics around the land question. So there's an older generation and perhaps a generation of leaders that came through the ranks with regard to how they had understood their liberation role as the kind of elder statesman that Robert Mugabe represented in the region in terms of the immediate first generation of post-independent leaders that took reign and sat to govern their different countries, etc. And I think that's something you can't ignore in terms of the historical platitude, the historical dynamic and platform that Mugabe and ZANU, and then later on ZANU-PF, after the merger between ZAPU and ZANU came together, you would see that as being a very critical space in the region in terms of the post-liberation dynamics and influencing other political change in the region. Unfortunately, I think people, when you look at the generation after this generation that sat there and paid homage and tribute to the former president, I think you have now a generation of people who kind of don't have that historical narrative in understanding the role that ZANU and under the leadership of Robert Mugabe played in the region. They kind of remember the years in terms of their socio-economic livelihood, the repercussions of what has happened in the whole kind of dislocation of society and where the economy is today. And so we kind of have that missing gap. There's a missing gap within that, and I think very often we get caught in these narratives where we don't necessarily recognize the contributions that someone like Mugabe made to the liberation struggle. But I also think it's a serious difficulty for the region because we are sitting in an immediate post-liberation landscape in the region. And this is the limits to change because we're still kind of sitting in that historical void where there's a historical narrative, but there's also one that's a contemporary set of issues, and we can't find the common ground in moving forward because we're caught in that kind of limit to change and limits to liberation that we see in the region.
So, Nisha, there's obviously been a focus on Mugabe's legacy and who he was as a leader and what he meant for the continent. When one of his family members stood up at the funeral, they spoke about how sad Mugabe was in his last years. And when we were speaking to his nephew on SABC News a little bit earlier on in the week as well, he spoke of that profound sadness of who he was, perhaps not as a leader, but someone who'd been stripped of their title.
Yeah, it's a sad. I mean, I can see where this is coming from because, I mean, given the fact that he had played a critical role, if not a significant role, in the whole liberation struggle of Zimbabwe, of what we see as I mentioned earlier, and then to be the kind of individual that gets stripped of that, and the kind of stripping of dignity, the stripping of memory, and of course the stripping of his leadership. I think it can essentially undermine an individual, and that kind of of the way in which it undermines your integrity as an individual can leave someone very broken. It's also a trust deficit because I think from where he was to where he ended up in his last years, particularly after he was forced to resign from his presidency, and of course a party that he probably gave his life to, which then began to change in the context of political struggle, political leadership, and how this played out in terms of the President Emerson Mnangagwa coming to power and so forth. I think it kind of leaves a bitter taste in someone's mindset in terms of what they left as a legacy and what that legacy will be remembered for. But again, we've got to also ask ourselves a very critical question here is when do leaders decide it's time to move on? And I think that's one of the dilemmas that Mugabe suffered from, even though it may not be his own making, or maybe the circumstances of the party forcing him to remain in power and so forth. But it's also for leaders to make that decision and say, it's time to move on. And if I move on, I leave my legacy intact.
Sanusha Naidu, thanks so much for your time on SABC News. That was Sanusha Naidu, a political analyst, joining us on the line there.